So back in 2020, Famitsu interviewed some of the developers of Final Fantasy IX to celebrate the game's 20th anniversary. And to honor the 25th anniversary, Famitsu has republished those interviews. So we're going to check those out in today's video and find out some of the development history of Final Fantasy IX. Spoiler alert, Hawaii was a very big influence. So to start off this interview, we turn to Hironobu Sakaguchi, who is the father of Final Fantasy, and they ask him the question about Final Fantasy's theme of returning to its roots, and what does that mean to him? Sakaguchi goes on to say, "It's Final Fantasy. Also, when we created the characters in the first game, we used the cute designs of Koichi Ishii, who was in charge of planning and graphics of the original Final Fantasy, and we wanted to create a world view and design that would evoke that image in a 3D Final Fantasy game. Furthermore, and this is something we always pay attention to, we wanted to value the basics of RPG production, such as meticulous construction down to the last detail, enemy actions that make you grin, and treasure chest placement." Famitsu would then interrupt and ask about characters like Garland. Was that a throwback to the original FF? Sakaguchi continues by saying, "I think I had a strong desire to include something nostalgic. I don't think it will lead to the return to the origins, but I also had the feeling that it would be good if the developers themselves felt a sense of nostalgia." And returning to its roots is actually a really great way to describe Final Fantasy IX, because that was such a weird period of time for Square Enix where they had just come off this generational run of Final Fantasy games, and they had entered the PlayStation 1 era of Final Fantasy with 7, 8, and 9 was going to be the cap-off of that era, so it was a pretty big deal. And with games like Final Fantasy 6, 7, and 8, which kind of moved away from the older themes of Final Fantasy, usually involving the crystal, having 9 be a love letter, which a lot of people view it as, to the entirety of Final Fantasy just kind of made the most sense. It was them saying goodbye to that era of Final Fantasy, but in a way that paid respect to everything that came before it. And with 9, it pretty much is the best representation of Final Fantasy at that time. It was medieval fantasy, dungeons, dragons, mages. The type of Final Fantasy that many people were familiar with 1 through 5. And it's kind of funny because it feels like back then there were those people who are like, you know what, I love Final Fantasy, but I don't like 6 or 7 or 8. I don't quite like the direction they're going in. I like that old school Final Fantasy. Does any of this ring a bell to you? 25 plus years later and nothing has changed. There are people nowadays who are like, you know what, I'm not into modern Final Fantasy. Give me old school Final Fantasy. So it's kind of funny how history repeats itself. Potentially nowadays, but for them, Square Enix was like, okay, we're going to give you what you want. We're going to give you that old school Final Fantasy that pays tribute to specifically 1 through 5, but you see and hear pieces of every Final Fantasy in 9, and I think one of the greatest examples of that is the music. The way I like to describe the soundtracks of Final Fantasy is that each soundtrack perfectly represents the world that they come from. So the music of 8 perfectly represent 8. The music of 7 perfectly represents 7. But with 9, not only does it perfectly represent the world of 9, but it also pays tribute to all of the other Final Fantasies. I hear pieces of 7 and 8's music in 9. I hear pieces of 6 in there. I hear pieces of 1 in there. So it was really cool how they were able to encompass the entire series leading up to that point and make it feel kind of like the ultimate Final Fantasy at the time. And then of course there's paying tribute by using a character like the name of Garland, or the entirety of the ending of Final Fantasy IX, which, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't played it, it's a complete throwback to the first Final Fantasy, with Kuja getting his hands on that crystal and using its memories to create the 4 fiends, which were essentially the 4 fiends of the first Final Fantasy. Now, I'm not saying they were pulled from FF1, but it's pulling from like the memory of what that crystal knows as an homage to those 4 fiends, and seeing them pop up in 9, and you gotta fight them to get to Kuja. It was just so really well done. And in my opinion, you know, really, again, culminated in like one of the ultimate Final Fantasies that kind of represented the best of the franchise for a lot of people. But also in terms of the way the game looks, yeah, it does look like the old school Final Fantasies, which again were, you know, limited by hardware and graphics, so they had to make these tinier, cuter, chibi looking characters, and they were depicted that way because that's the only way they could do it with the graphics back then. But with 9, it's like they took that inspiration and brought it back, and you've got characters that are kind of deformed and super short. Zidane's got a really big head and a tiny body. I don't know if there's anybody in this game that's over the height of 5 feet, except for maybe like Garland, who might be the tallest of every character in 9. Most of them are really tiny, cute, chibi characters that really do represent that old school graphical style, including the world map, just navigating the world map. You had that in 7 and 8, but there's something about the way it looks in 9 that really kind of feels closer to what they had in those earlier Final Fantasies, specifically the first one, that just kind of, adds to that return to the roots kind of vibe. Sakaguchi also goes on to say that that's one of the reasons why they had a different set of character designers for 9 instead of bringing in Tetsuya Nomura. And he goes on to say that he loved Tetsuya Nomura's designs. He remembers the sketchbook that Nomura brought with him when he was first interviewed, but for him to kind of match what they had with those older Final Fantasies, they knew they had to bring somebody else on board who could kind of perfectly represent that. Because with Nomura, he had his style of 7 and 8, which was great, but for what they needed, it didn't really quite work for that. And that's when Shuko Murase would come in, and he would be like the main character designer for 9. Now, the last thing that they ask Sakaguchi is about the theme of life, which kind of permeates a lot of Final Fantasy games, especially the ones that Sakaguchi was involved with, but what does that mean to him in the sense of Final Fantasy IX? He goes on to say, the idea that new life is born and that death is also a cycle is an important theme for me. Having experienced the death of my mother, the birth of my daughter, and the death of a close friend from illness, I want to keep in my mind the meaning behind those experiences. And I want to embed themes in my game production, which is my outlet for expression, by turning them into concrete stories to a certain extent. And that's honestly kind of a really cool, beautiful way to not only immortalize those thoughts and those feelings, but the people that made you feel those things. And it does ring true with FF9. There's quite a lot to discuss, maybe too much for this one video, but you look at characters like Vivi, who are kind of dealing with this idea of, will I cease to exist one day? And he meets other black mages, and they talk about losing their mages and how they had to bury them, and coming to terms with understanding life and living and death, and one day you will just cease to stop working. It's a really scary topic to kind of think about, especially for a character like Vivi, who is just a kid. But he's also a pretty emotionally mature character that by the time you get to the end of the game and you read that narration from Vivi, he's fully accepted what's going to happen to him and that he's had an incredible time. So he's able to kind of come to terms with the fact that he will just cease to exist one day. But then he leaves the little other Vivis afterwards that kind of show up and hang out with the party. So his memory continues to live on. He lives on in the sky, I believe is the exact words that he uses. But I also think of a character like Kuja, who was so bound to his predetermined fate and destiny, this obsession with, well, I'm just going to die anyway. I might as well cause as much havoc as I possibly can, and I'm going to bring you guys with me. And the thing that's most beautiful and sad about Kuja is his redemption, which happens at the very end of the game. And it's kind of poetic because throughout this entire story, Zidane has been a character who has been so free. He's got his own free will, he's hanging out with his friends, he's going on his own journey, he's able to live his own life away from that whole genome setup that Garland was part of and that Kuja was part of. But Kuja was so obsessed with that idea of what he was supposed to be that it eats away at him, and it's not until the very last moments of his life where he gets to experience that freedom that Zidane has been feeling his entire life. It's really sad and it's beautiful, but what he chooses to do in those last few moments of experiencing that freedom is good. He chooses to help Zidane and give a message to the other genomes of where Zidane and the party are so they can get out of there. So it's a really beautiful full circle moment for the character of Kuja and his relationship with Zidane. Now up next we have a pretty radical, out there crazy depiction of the trance system by the game's director Hiroyuki Ito, who goes on to cite the film 2001: A Space Odyssey as being the influence for the trance system. And this is not coming from Famitsu, this is a translation from Automaton, so it's going to be super accurate compared to some of the machine learning stuff from Famitsu. So Ito goes on to say, or Ito, it may be pronounced Ito, either way, this is a trip. So he goes on to say, in the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, when the monolith, the black slab, appears, the apes acquire the ability to use tools. Although it depends on interpretation, I felt that this was not a depiction of the apes being given a new ability, but rather a depiction of an ability they had always possessed being awakened. It's as if a program already planted in their genome was activated by some kind of stimulus. In terms of game design, the character's trance may represent a moment of their evolution, guided by the time, place, and their destiny. In this sense, from a development standpoint, you could say that the trance system was something that was meant to be born. What was he smoking when he was developing this game and watched that movie? Either way, can I have some? Because that is brilliant. Talk about watching a movie that then inspires a pretty big game mechanic in Final Fantasy IX, the trance system, which in the game I believe they describe it as like this moment of like pure emotion all kind of coming to a boiling point, and then you transform and boom, you got mega superpowers, you've got crazy stats and abilities that you can do. The trance system is super cool in 9 specifically. The only downside is that you couldn't control when you tranced unless you were super careful about watching that trance meter and running away from battles, but the more damage it took, the more that trance bar filled up. And once it was filled up, that was it. Trance was active. You couldn't choose to bank it. You couldn't choose when to activate it. If trance was there, you were going to trance whether you wanted to or not, which created a lot of scenarios, I think, for many players, including myself, where you're at the end of a battle, a character gets hit, they trance, and then someone else boops the enemy, and then they're boom, gone, dead, and then you've wasted your trance, essentially. So trance was super cool. It was just kind of a frustrating mechanic, and you had to be super careful about how you managed that meter, because the last thing you wanted to do was have a character go trance before a boss battle, and then you don't have that opportunity in the boss when you could use it the most. But either way, the way that trance system came to be is insane. I think it's brilliant. And then to end his section of the interview, which I will summarize, they ask him, why do you think Final Fantasy IX is still so popular to this day? Why does it have a large fan base? And he would go on to say that a lot of people probably played this when they were younger. And when you're a kid, you can be kind of awkward, you can struggle to make friends and get to know people, but when you sit down and play a game like this and you meet these characters like Zidane and Vivi and Garnet, they're true to themselves characters. They don't try to hide who they are. They are very honest. They say what they're thinking. They're emotional. And that can help us as players empathize. And he thinks that maybe that memory of empathy is what becomes so important to us, which is what attaches us not only to those characters, but those experiences that we have. And I would 100% agree with him. Like as a kid, I got bullied a lot. I hated school, even though I did very good. I brought home a lot of straight A report cards, mind you. Even then, I hated school. I got bullied. I didn't like it. So when I came home, I could sit down and play a game like Final Fantasy 7 or 8 or 9 and just escape into this world with these wonderful characters and just kind of learn so much about storytelling and how to build great characters, but also kind of reflecting on my own life as a kid. I think I may have been a little too advanced as a kid, to be quite honest. But these games and these stories, these characters can really teach us a lot about ourselves in our life and prepare us for things that, we don't even expect to experience once we get older. So we have large attachments to these worlds and these characters, and I think that's why they stick with us. They create these memories that we super, super cherish, and as you get older, things get harder, and you can always kind of draw back on those memories, which is a really, honestly beautiful thing. So up next, we move on to the game's art director, Hideo Manaba, who gives some really interesting insight into what was originally supposed to be the ending of the game, which we see as that narration. It's narrated by Vivi. Turns out initially they had another character who would narrate that section. So this comes through by way of talking about the game's final boss, including Kuja and Necron, and how did that all come to be, and they get onto the subject of that narration. So Manaba goes on to say, no, I think it changed several times. As for the final development, Mr. Ito, the director, had a lot of influence in terms of how to wrap up the theme. It was actually planned for Kuja, not Vivi, to be the one to narrate the ending. I remember that Mr. Ito had the idea that there is not a single bad guy in this story. However, considering the player's psychology, it was decided that Vivi should be the one to narrate the ending, and so it settled on its current form. That's a really interesting observation. On the one hand, when you really do examine the story, I guess you could say there aren't technically bad guys in this game. Kuja is misguided for sure. He does some really awful things. Queen Braun also does some really awful things. So I think maybe there are some bad people, or just people who are in weird circumstances who do bad things, unfortunately. But even for Kuja, like I mentioned earlier, in his final moments, he doesn't choose to continue to be an evil bad guy. He chooses the path of good and does one final good action that helps to redeem the character. So I could see that kind of working as Kuja narrating what he learned throughout this experience of, you know, being the antagonist to Zidane, maybe having these thoughts in the back of his head that were just now coming out. Maybe it would have been a little too jarring, but I think settling on Vivi being the one giving that speech and writing that letter makes more sense. Because again, Vivi's a character who has been struggling throughout this entire game of his own existence. When will he stop? What will happen to other people? So for him to go on that journey and conclude it by accepting his fate, but also understanding that the journey was so incredible and had such an impact on him, I think is actually a much more fitting end to the narration. And I think a lot of people may have been confused on that first playthrough of who was speaking. I think there's a lot of people, including me, even when I was a kid, I didn't realize it was Vivi who was speaking in that moment. I thought maybe it was Zidane, you know, or yeah, it could have been Kuja for some people, but making it Vivi I think makes more sense. It hits way harder for sure, because Vivi is like one of the most beloved characters in the franchise. It's like protect Vivi at all costs. So when you reach the end of that game and he, you know, accepts his fate and ceases to exist, it's a super hard gut punch. And when he's not there, when Zidane does come back and everyone has that reunion, it's even sadder. Although if you look at the very end of the game, if you look at the castle, the way that the shadows are hitting the castle, Vivi's there. You can see him clear as day in that formation. It's a really nice little touch. But I think, yeah, having it be Vivi was the right choice. Now, the one we will end on is from Toshiyuki Itahana, who was brought in as a character designer to kind of fill out some of the side characters, clean up some stuff with the backgrounds. He even talks about how they made meticulous edits in Photoshop to clean up backgrounds to make things more easier to see, to help the characters stand out more. I can't imagine all of the Photoshop files they had back then. It must have been overwhelming. But they bring up the subject of Final Fantasy VII Remake, which had released in that year of 2020. And if they were to remake 9, what does he personally think? So Itahana goes on to say, fans often ask for a remake. However, 9 is so huge that if I were to remake it, I would probably have to devote the rest of my life to it. He's not wrong there. Look at Hamaguchi, who is the director of Rebirth in Part 3. That entire development team has spent, at this point, almost 15 years crafting that trilogy. It's insane. FF9 is a massive game. If you were to remake FF9 in the scale of an FF7, you would need probably 4 games to do so. It's such a massive, massive game. Unless, of course, you were able to do what I think would be pretty cool is a AA level kind of remake of FF9, which keeps the scale of the original game, but just kind of upgrades the graphics, adds voice acting, quality of life stuff, translation adjustments. So you'd be doing a pretty faithful, high quality remake, but it would be on a scale that I think is financially and in terms of development power more feasible and more realistic. Because it ain't realistic to do a Final Fantasy remake on the scale of 7 for every Final Fantasy. That's just not going to happen. Square Enix would probably go nuts. They'd go bankrupt. They wouldn't have any dev teams to make other games. So you got to find a nice balance with these remakes, assuming, you know, they ever happen or are real. But I think that's the way you'd want to do it. But he continues by saying, that said, 9 is a very memorable title for me, and I think it's the root of my current drawing style. So if it were to be remade, I would definitely want to be involved. And of course, we don't know what's going on with a alleged Final Fantasy IX remake, but we do know that many years ago, there was a video that came out that I've cited a few times from Paolo from Tokyo, who has a wonderful channel. If you're interested in anything Japan, I highly recommend you check it out. He does some really great day in the life videos, but anyway, he was following a girl in one of those videos who happened to work at Square Enix, and there was a section of the video where he interviewed Toshiyuki Itahana, who was working on a project at that time. However, obviously he couldn't say what the project was. So maybe, just maybe, he was working on some character designs for a remake and he actually is involved, so that'd be kind of cool if that is the case. Again, we don't know what's going on with a potential FF9 remake, just assume right now it ain't real. But if they could pull an FF7 remake and bring in as many of the old school developers as they could to kind of shepherd that project into the modern day, I think that'd be pretty sick. But with that being said, that is the video. Those were the interviews from Famitsu from 2020 brought back for the 25th anniversary of Final Fantasy IX. A lot of cool information there. One of the biggest things that I didn't really touch on in the video was that Hawaii, which is where the game was developed, had a pretty big influence on this game, its developers. It was a really beautiful, relaxed climate that even influenced some of the characters like Lonnie the bounty hunter. She was the game's Hawaiian representative, and even the way she looked, her sword was based off of one of the volcanoes in Hawaii. It's super cool and pretty different, so it makes Final Fantasy IX a bit of a unique Final Fantasy in the sense that it was technically, as they like to say, a multinational Final Fantasy, which I don't think they've done since they had crossover with Japan and Hawaii making this game. So that's pretty cool. But let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. As always, I will leave links in the description to the full articles if you'd like to check those out for yourself. But I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.